Thank you, my good friend Daniel. Good morning. Thanks for being here. So this morning we're going to talk about school leadership and research findings for international and global mindedness. And let me start with a preface. I am an IB staff member. I'm Maria Hersey. I'm a regional development specialist for the IB, and I've had the pleasure of working for them for 8 years. But this was an independent research study. It was part of my requirements to finish up my doctorate from the University of Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida. 10 years in the making. So I'm going to share the results with you and hopefully have some conversations. The purpose of this study was to investigate the development of global mindedness within the leadership of international primary schools. Now, I know that the term that we use in the IB is international mindedness, and that's the term that I began with. And in a minute, I'm going to show you why I made the shift from international mindedness and brought in global mindedness as well. For me personally, I really wanted to look at what's the difference between international and global mindedness, because sometimes global mindedness gets a somewhat controversial or negative tone because we think about things like globalization and making everything the same, forgetting about culture, forgetting about differences. So I wanted to see, are there any similarities? What are the major differences? What are some things that we need to consider? And let me go back to this, IB's definition of international mindedness. I've been in a couple of sessions where we've talked about research for international mindedness and what does the IB mean and what's the IB's definition of international mindedness, and can we just come up with a definition and present it to schools? And I thought about that for a little bit, and I'm actually kind of glad that there isn't one definition that we present, because I think that stops the conversation. And I think that part of this idea of international mindedness is to have people talk about it, to have some controversy, to have some conversations. And my concern is if we present the IB definition of international mindedness, then people stop talking and stop having conversations. So I just needed to throw that in there. So personally for me, I mostly have worked in the Americas office, but I've had the opportunity to visit schools in South America, in the Africa, Europe, and the Middle East region, and work with some really fantastic colleagues. And I wanted to know, are they more globally minded in one place than they are in another? What are some of the things that we might see in terms of variations across the regions? I was assuming initially that in the United States we'd be a little bit less globally minded because we have less interaction with different cultures. Even though we're a diverse country, are they really truly cultural interactions that we get to participate in? So Robert Harrison, who is across the hall, and he and Christine Amos are talking about the learner profile review, and I have some cards and a QR code. If you haven't participated in that review or that survey, please pick up a card and do so, or go to the IB website. They've got some really exciting information and data that are coming. But right now, when we talk about international mindedness within the IB, we're talking about the umbrella term under which we define the goals of international education. So in particular, you all know the learner profile, where we talk about the attributes of internationally minded people and the outcomes of education for international mindedness. That's at the forefront of everything we do. And certainly, you know, the IB learner profile and recognizing our common humanity and shared guardianship of the planet to help create a better and more peaceful world. And we've had some adjustments and some movements and some really exciting things. Robert's been talking about global engagement and what that means. Education for international mindedness relies on the development of learning environments that value a world in all of its complexity as the broadest context for learning. So it's a foray into a global consciousness and global engagement. Language is a reality, right, and resource, inquiry, action, and reflection on challenges including conflicts, rights, and authentic service learning within the community. So those are kind of some of the conversations that we have. And there are a couple of books that we have that IB Publications has produced. I have them here, something from George Walker, The Changing Face of International Education. You might want to take a look at these at some point in time or visit the Publications website. But before we get into this, I want you to take a look at these graphics, if you will, for just a minute. I borrowed this from my friend Libby yesterday. I thought it was a great idea. I'm going to ask you to turn and talk to your neighbor if you can. Decide which graphic of the three best represents your interpretation of the relationship between international and global mindedness. So taking the two terms, international and global mindedness, which one of these diagrams for you best describes that relationship? Just take like 2 minutes to discuss it with your neighbor. Anybody willing to share their thoughts, what they chose, and why? This is one of my favorite people in the room, Dr. Ian Hill.
Do you want to say something too? Are you sure? Well, we had a discussion here and we were saying that international could be interpreted as between nations. Nations are political entities. They're not culturally determined, because you can have many cultures in the one nation. You can have cultures across the same culture across several nations. So global seem to us to be wider and bigger than international and less political, would I say?
No. Anybody else?
I mean, I'll follow that, because actually we had a very similar conversation only a couple of feet away about the difference between the kind of political nature of the term international and the maybe more encompassing nature of global. And in fact, we talked a lot about C because of how well possibly international could fit into the kind of all-encompassing nature of global-mindedness. But then we also spent a lot of time talking about A, because if there was any differences between the two, and if you ever want to highlight those differences, then A might be a better graphic in order to be able to do that. I don't know if you want to add to that at all, Lisa. Okay.
Thanks. Anybody else?
I think I actually might have gone in the opposite direction. I saw international as more external understanding, and global-mindedness being more of a personal, internal understanding. So I chose C.
Thanks. Anybody else? No right answer, as you know. Just something to provoke our conversation and get us thinking about these two terms. And I went through a very similar process, and I'm glad that Ian brought up the relationship between nations, because that's what you'll see in terms of the definitions from my research. So this particular quote from George Walker, the former Director General of the IB, changed everything for me in terms of my study. 3 years of really thinking about looking at international mindedness, and I don't normally do this, but I'm going to read this. So George said in a 2007 edition of IB World magazine, "I much prefer the term global mindedness to international mindedness. The concept of an international world belongs to the 20th century, when events took place in distant, exotic countries whose schools, to use Alec Peterson's phrase, were across frontiers. In the 21st century, those frontiers have been largely removed by electronic communication and ease of travel. Today, the global world starts on our doorstep, where the cost of buying a house is affected by the cost of labor in China, manufacturing in India modifies the weather in Florida, and mass migration alters our national identity." So that gave me permission to start using the term global-mindedness and really talking about the connection between the two. And George talks about three things. I mean, the context of the study was globalization, and he talks about complexity, diversity, and inequality. And that inequality piece was a really big deal for me, because I think global education and international education is at the forefront of conversation, in the US particularly, but in my mind for the wrong reasons. Because everything you read, even by groups that talk about the need for global competence or global education, it's still about global economic competition, right? That's still the focus. Those are still the conversations that are being had. How do we make sure that we're competitive in a global economy, that we're the best in the world? And for me, that's not what it's about. It was about education for social justice. It was about collaboration. It was about understanding other cultures. So that's kind of what I looked at in terms of chapter 2 of my study and the overview and the background. I looked at the globalizing processes and the forces that were pushing up from the effects of globalization, and these notions of complexity and diversity and interconnectedness, and that we can see and speak to each other in real time very quickly, but also the inequalities that that produces in the world as well. And all the forces and processes that you look at, cultural forces, economic and political forces, and social forces, how do we really get people not only to understand and respect differences, but have really productive conversations about those differences? So defining globalization for me, I read a lot of work by Kennedy and Cohn and Held. And so this was the definition of globalization for my study, a multidimensional phenomenon that employs a process approach. It's multiple processes. It's not about just technological change and the speed of the internet, but it intensifies and connects global flows of knowledge, power, economy, technology, people, values, and ideas across borders with a variety of effects, some positive, some negative. And then when I looked at global-mindedness and the dimensions of global-mindedness, and I really kind of pulled apart what we talk about in terms of international mindedness for the IB. And then I used some work from Dr. E. Jane Hett from San Diego State University. She did a study in 1997, and she developed an instrument called the GMS, or the Global Mindedness Scale. I replicated and kind of modified that survey for my study. But Hett talks instead about attributes for international mindedness, she talks about dimensions of global mindedness. And for me as a PYP person, that means big concepts and big ideas, the kind of conceptual lens. So Hett talks about the 5 dimensions of global mindedness that she identified through a really extensive research review. And she looked at the work of Hanvey, she looked through multiple disciplines, and she found that cultural pluralism, efficacy, responsibility, interconnectedness, and global centrism were the 5 dimensions of global mindedness. And then, of course, you know the attributes of the learner profile within the IB. So for me, the dimensions of global mindedness are kind of a whole to part, a macro version, while international mindedness in terms of the learner profile attributes is a part to whole version, so kind of a micro perspective of things. So when I looked at the definitions, and I actually used Ian's definition of international mindedness within my study, and I put in this piece between nations. I talked about really kind of identifying international mindedness, really looking at the relationships between nations. And my question was, what about those cultures or countries that exist outside of the confines of a nation state? So that's why I really focused on global mindedness. You'll see in green, you still see interconnectedness, and you see those words. You see the word tolerant and action and global. So the blue represents the differences between the definitions in some sense. Now, understanding that what you read on the paper doesn't necessarily mean the intent of everything, and we might be missing things, but these were the things that I kind of found to be the differences. So those were my 2 comparison things that I looked at. And then these were the actual definitions that I used. So an openness to and curiosity about the world and people of other cultures, which serves to develop a profound level of understanding of the complexity and diversity of human interactions. It's described through the attributes of the learner profile. So that was the definition I chose for international mindedness. And then for global mindedness, I went with Hett, a worldview in which one sees oneself as connected to the world community and feels a sense of responsibility for its members and reflects this through demonstrated attitudes, beliefs, values, and behavior. So the global mindedness piece really talks about being a member of a global community and feeling a responsibility for the members of a global community. So those were kind of the primary differences. A lot of similarities, right? A lot of things that are fundamentally the same, but just some slight nuances to take into consideration. Just to give you a sense of what the dimensions of global mindedness are for Hett, cultural pluralism, looking at different cultures with appreciation and a belief that all have something of value to offer. That's a pretty big statement. So not only do I recognize differences, but those differences or those beliefs have value. Efficacy, individual actions make a difference, and you have to be involved in national and international issues. National issues are just as important as international issues, and you have a recognition of that. Global centrism is that piece about thinking of what is good for the global community, not just for one's own country, and you make judgments based on that. So you have a very broad perspective, and you take all things into consideration. Interconnectedness is again, you have those words, awareness and appreciation, and again, that sense of global belonging or kinship with the human family. And then responsibility, so you have moral responsibility to improve conditions in some way. So you recognize the connections. So here are my 4 research questions. What are the differences across the dimensions of global mindedness? So if I'm in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, or the Americas, are there differences in the levels of global mindedness? I'm going to talk about that term because it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. What are the relationships between demographic variables and the dimensions of global mindedness? So does my age, does my gender have an impact on how globally minded I am or the attributes of global mindedness? What are the relationships between a model with, so if I throw all the demographic variables together, age, where I live, how long I've been with the IB, what does that do to the dimensions of global-mindedness and the score on the instrument? And how do the dimensions of global-mindedness relate to the learner profile? So I actually pulled the learner profile in, and I made 10 questions, made that a part of my survey with 10 questions, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But these are the things that I looked at. So HET's original instrument has 30 questions. I included 10 additional questions that were related to the learner profile, so that's 40. And then I added 15 questions that were demographic, so I needed to find out a little bit about these principals. So I wanted to know how old they were, male or female, what country were they born in, if they traveled, and if they did travel, how long did they travel, how many countries they went and visited, if they'd ever lived actually outside of their country of birth, what their primary language was, how many languages they spoke, if they spoke a second language, how many years they were with the IB, the number of years they were authorized, and what IB region that they were in. And I mentioned earlier the work of Dr. Het. In 1993, she developed the global-mindedness scale. She used those 5 dimensions that we talked about. I put in the 10 questions, and I sent, I have some very good friends within the IB, my experts in the IB, and I asked them do a content validity test for me. So I developed the questions. I sent them out to people. I got some feedback. I made some modifications to the questions. Then the background information questions, and I used a 5-point Likert scale. It was an online survey, so I used Key Survey for that and sent it out to the schools. And I did have a letter of support from the IB, so I had some benefits. It's still a small study, but I had the benefit of having a letter of support from the IB, which I sent out. I knew some of the people involved in the study because I just looked at PYP schools, so I got pretty good response. I only looked at principals in IB PYP schools. They had to have been authorized for at least 3 years because I wanted them to have gone at least through one program evaluation cycle. I felt that was fair. I got 115 usable responses. 22 different countries of birth is what I got from the principals that responded out of those 115. And you see this IB Latin America, and yes, I do know that we're IB Americas, but I didn't want to group the schools in South America with the schools in the US and Canada. I wanted to see if there was some diversity in those responses. So I got a couple of responses back. You do know that we're not IBLA anymore, we're IB of the Americas. And I said, I do know that, but for this study, I just wanted to see what the differences were. So those are the number of participants by region. I had 31 responses from Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, 26 from Asia Pacific, 41 from IB North America, so the United States, Canada, and the Caribbean, and then 17 from my group called IB Latin America. And this is what I found. So these were my descriptive statistics. So these are the people that came back to me. 61% of those 115 PYP principals were female. So, and the majority, 43%, are between the ages of 43 and 53. The larger majority, 40%, were born in the United States. I thought this was interesting. 99% of those 115 had traveled outside of their country of birth, so only one person hadn't. 63% had actually lived outside of their country of birth. Again, the majority, which makes sense because the larger number of schools right now are in the Americas. 36% were from North America. The primary language was English with 85%. Second language fluency, majority do not speak a second language. I thought that was interesting. So 56% did not speak a second language. The majority of participants, 38%, had visited 20 or more countries. And years in education, 69%, 22 years or more. So that says to me we have a population that's aging a little bit in PYP schools of those 115 that we have. So here are some of my findings. Significant differences across the dimensions of global-mindedness for international primary school principals. So across the regions, I found significant differences for cultural pluralism, responsibility, and global centrism. I found that in Latin America, IB Latin America, those 17 schools, they had high levels of cultural pluralism. So the interconnectedness, and I had questions about, does language play a role in that? What might that be? And these areas of global centrism, that's where I saw the most significant differences for the three dimensions. Efficacy and interconnectedness showed out flat in terms of the data. significant relationships between the 5 dimensions of global-mindedness and demographic variables. The 2 largest relationships were between gender and the second language spoken. So if you spoke a second language, you had a higher level of global-mindedness. That was one of the most significant relationships in the study. And that females demonstrated a higher levels of efficacy than males. And at the end, I'll show you, Head's surveys have been replicated about 11 times and is still used pretty regularly. And that information about females and second languages keeps coming through, so that definitely warrants some further study. There are significant relationships across and between the 5 dimensions of global-mindedness and these demographic variables. So age makes a difference, country of birth, how long you were outside of your country of birth, the number of countries you visited, how many years of experience you had in education, how many years of experience you had with IB, and where you were located. So these things played a large role. They had significant effect. The older you were, the higher your levels of global-mindedness, which kind of makes sense. It's kind of a common sense thing. There are significant relationships between the 5 dimensions of global-mindedness and demographic variables for international primary school principals. So just to break that down a little bit, genders for females, gender for gender, and efficacy and global centrism, that had the most effect for those dimensions. Age, the most effect for efficacy. For country of birth and where you were born, how globally minded you were for the dimension of cultural pluralism, that was also the same for travel outside of the country of birth. The 2 that were interesting to me, length outside of country of birth and the IB region, had the most significant effect for the 5 dimensions for IB region and for efficacy, global centrism, interconnectedness, and responsibility. And then this particular finding talks about the relationships between global-mindedness and the attributes of the learner profile. So if it says cultural pluralism and 9 characteristics, there were strong relationships between the dimension of cultural pluralism and 9 of the attributes of the learner profile. Reflective is the one that did not show a relationship. Of efficacy, the same thing, 9 characteristics except for open-minded. So strong relationships for efficacy and the learner profile. Interconnectedness, again, 9 characteristics except for reflective. Responsibility, also 9, with the exception of risk taker. And global centrism only had 3. So there were only 3 significant correlations for global centrism, and the learner profile was for open-mindedness, communicators, and knowledgeable. Comments, questions, thoughts from that?
I'm not familiar with the survey by Head, but can you describe for me what you mean when you say there was a higher level of global-mindedness?
You're actually going to, I think I have enough copies because you're going to take the survey. So I'm going to let you take, and I'm glad that you said that, because one of my big quandaries was, I don't want to say you're more globally minded than the person sitting next to you. So levels was the term that we decided to use just to describe the scores, because each question that you answer has a Likert scale from 1 to 5. So you guys are going to actually take that. And so the levels refers to whether it was 200 or 40. I'm glad you asked that question. Thanks. Anything else? So, any questions about those in terms of my findings? Any things that stuck out to you? Any things you're wondering about? Anything that's provocative?
Why do you think that reflective came up both for cultural pluralism and interconnectedness? I mean, as the kind of one attribute that doesn't get represented by those definitions. What do I think? Throw the question right back at me. Okay. You know. You know, actually, I'm not sure, because I guess, you know, I think in general being reflective is a challenging thing for people, and so, but I'm just surprised that it didn't come up in other areas then. If, but specifically for cultural pluralism and interconnectedness, I'm not really sure. You know.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that I put as a follow-up, because I thought that was pretty interesting. I couldn't really make sense of that. The other interesting thing was for Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, and Latin America, they were stronger in global centrism, cultural pluralism, interconnectedness, and global centrism. And so we had some conversations at my defense about why that might happen. But I wasn't sure about that. And what was really interesting to me, too, was the piece about global centrism and why only the three of those kind of hung together.
I do think it's interesting about the open-mindedness under global centrism. I'm not so surprised about communication and knowledge. Much like in the MYP, we say the ATL of the areas of interaction is what teachers know intuitively, instinctively. That's what they do, is that. And the same thing, communication and knowledge are sort of benchmarks of all education systems. That's what they feel the most comfortable with. When they get into those other areas that I've actually heard described as airy-fairy, such as reflective or open-mindedness or particularly risk takers, that's so much more open to interpretation. So that didn't surprise me as much on the global centrism, which itself is open to interpretation.
Anyone else? Comments, questions? I'm glad you brought that up, Larry, because that was one of the reasons, that was one of my primary reasons for looking at school leaders, because all the research says that the school leader has the most influence and the commitment to the program and the understanding of international mindedness. And so I absolutely do think if the school leader doesn't have an understanding of global mindedness or international mindedness, if they don't know what it looks like, if they're not modeling it, if they're not a part of it, a school might struggle with their own type of understanding. And there was a lot of research. Part of my lit review talked about research and the role of the leader, and it's just critical that the leader not only understands that but communicates that throughout everything they know to kind of develop that culture throughout the school community. And I know that the schools, it's something that schools struggle with, I'd like to see them having more conversations about what this means, and I'm going to talk about that in the findings a little bit. Anything else? So conclusions. One of the things that came out of this was the 5 subscales of global mindedness are related to each other and form one construct, confirming Het. So this instrument has been around since 1997. It's been around for a while. Het did an extensive literature review. She did an extensive test of validity and reliability, and they still hung together. Nothing else came out. Another dimension didn't come out. There wasn't a strong outlier. So those 5 dimensions are still very strong, and her instrument is still being used fairly regularly. The personal characteristics of gender, age, primary language, and the ability to speak a second language have a positive relationship for the development of global mindedness for primary school principals. Remember, it's a small study, 117 principals. But male or female, how old you are, what your primary language was, and your ability to speak a second language all help improve or enhance your scores on the GMS. So the primary language was, I asked them, what language was your mother tongue language, what language did you speak? And that was interesting to develop that research question as well. So the primary language was their mother tongue language that they spoke the majority of the time, and the majority was English. That influenced it in a positive way. This is our research department too. And geographic location may influence the development of global mindedness. And I talked about those pieces for cultural pluralism and global centrism, and where you live, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, or where your school was located, they had higher levels of higher levels for global centrism and cultural pluralism. So, other conclusion, length and types of travel experiences have a positive impact on the development of global mindedness. The amount of time that was spent outside a country of birth has a positive impact. Principals 20 plus or more years, that was the largest group. But the more you traveled, the more time you spent outside of a country of birth meant you had a higher score on the global mindedness scale. And professional experiences influence the development of global mindedness. So higher scores for those who had more time with IB, who traveled more, who had more years of teaching experience. The number of years during my defense, my professor said, what's this going to do for you with your job? But The number of years IB authorized and the number of languages spoken are not related to the development of global-mindedness. There weren't any significant relationships in the study. So if you were authorized 3 years, or some of the schools had been authorized up to, I think, 11 years, it didn't matter. And if you spoke 2 languages, 3 languages, up to 8 languages, that didn't make a difference in the data. And global-mindedness is a concept that subsumes the attributes of international mindedness as defined by the learner profile. So they were related. There was a way that you were able to bring those into the dimensions of global-mindedness. There wasn't any strong disconnect in the data. And just to give you a sense, from some of the previous findings, Het found females were higher, Jillian found females were higher. Duckworth, Levy, and Levy conducted a study at George Mason University, and they looked at international mindedness for international teachers in the George Mason Fast Train program. They found that there was no correlation, so no relationship for females. And Keel actually did a study in Ohio for agriculture agents. He found that males were actually higher, although a low effect size. But then you see Smith in 2008 found that females were higher. One of my committee members, my statistics chair, actually just conducted a study of, I think, more than 500 teachers across 5 public universities in the state of Florida. He found the same thing with females as well. Age, so you see there's a lot of, not repetition, but the same findings in the different areas across the different studies for global-mindedness. Questions or comments about this? Yes?
Well, I guess I've got a teacher voice, right?
I'm going to let you speak.
So, okay. So, my first impression is that it's not entirely surprising what you've discovered. I mean, it's not counterintuitive, maybe except for the language part. I guess a question I would have is, it's not so what, it's so what do we do about it? And, in other words, and this is not, I guess, part of your research, but you're in a situation to have reflected on this and to ask yourself whether there are certain things that we could do to, I guess, improve the score. My third comment is simply editorial, which is I think the point of departure between distinguishing between global-mindedness and international-mindedness is problematic, but I'll leave it at that.
No, and I think I would agree with you on that, and I'm not making a prompt for one over the other. It's just, are there some similarities between that? How are we going to describe it as schools? I think the biggest struggle, and I think one of my reasons for looking at that is teachers, schools sometimes really struggle with this whole concept of international mindedness. And when you go on authorization and evaluation visits, and you look at the program evaluation study, and you look at that piece about philosophy, sometimes we score ourselves high in that level, but when you get into the school, it's the 5 Fs, right? The foods, flags, the festivals. What kind of conversations are we having about international mindedness? And for me, it's how do we push schools towards a deeper understanding of international mindedness? Understanding that I come from a biased perspective, right? I live in the United States. And because of the IB, I've been able to travel around the world. That's made a difference on my life and my perspective. So for me, how do we help teachers who may not have that opportunity, whether they live in the United States or another country because it's simply expensive or whatever the reason might be, how do we really up the level of conversation about understanding for international mindedness? And I'm not sure that just saying it's the learner profile works, because you can walk into a school and it's naming the attributes, so we have it posted everywhere in the school, or the kids, we give them awards for this, but they really understand what it means to be internationally or globally minded. Do they really understand about the level of global consciousness or global engagement?
I come back to that wonderful winner of the Mexican lady who we honored with America's Prize, and who said it towards the end of her speech. There is no contradiction between being a member of this country, of Mexico, and so on. So the challenge I have with global-mindedness as a concept is that it fails to recognize the specificity of the historical experience where people live. And what you're really trying to do is to get people who live in a particular set of historical circumstances and institutions to understand that there are other countries with other sorts of institutions, and to take it to a level of kind of global-mindedness, which fails to recognize the specificity of languages and cultures and historical experiences which have shaped those cultures. seems to me both not to do honor to your own country, because it is shaped by specifics, but also not to be able to put oneself in the mind of specific other people, as opposed to some sort of generalized feeling of goodwill about being global, you know, because it's all very well to feel generally good about things, but it's the tough part is in the details.
I think it's a good point, John, and I think I'm going to talk about some of these contributions, but I think when Lisa said, what do you mean when you say higher levels of global-mindedness, I didn't want to go through, I didn't actually present the scores anywhere in my data. So I didn't say 150 to 200, I didn't talk about that at all. And for me, it's more or less a continuum and what your experiences are and where you want to be. I mean, you can be to the end of Anthony Appiah and talk about cultural cosmopolitanism and being a citizen of the world. And then I think going back to your piece, which is the conversation that we always have, if I'm internationally or globally minded, does that mean I don't know where I'm from? Does it mean I don't respect my own values and cultures? Does it mean I don't have a recognition and appreciation of the differences and the reason that happens? So I think it's a good point.
In viewing your research, what do you think are some key elements that we need to implement in schools so we can raise this generation of globally minded people?
Let me go through the contributions and what I think, and then I'm going to ask the group because I think that's a good point. Contributions, hopefully it provides a multinational, not a cross-cultural perspective, because the majority came from a particular area. So a multinational perspective regarding the development of global and international mindedness confirms HET's dimensions of global mindedness. Hopefully it's going to inform the field of educational leadership, preparation, and practice related to the development of a more global perspective of education. And I really hope it informs leadership recruitment and selection and professional development. What are we looking for in school leadership? How are we selecting them? And how do we provide professional development for them? So possible implications, identifying the GMS and supporting the GMS as one reflective tool for identifying and understanding the dimensions of global-mindedness for pre-service instruction, professional development, leader recruitment, and selection. One tool, just as a reflective tool, not to say you're more globally minded than you are, so we're going to give you the job, but where are you in that term of your level of development? Where are you in that process? School leaders who understand and reflect upon the dimensions of global-mindedness may provide a clear vision and framework for the development of a global perspective within a school community. I mean, it's really about recognizing that we're connected, right? We're globally connected. We're thinking about other people. We're thinking about cause and effect. We're thinking with a larger purpose, not forgetting where we are, who we are, but we have a strong awareness of that, and we feel a responsibility in some sense. It supports the implementation of the learner profile as attributes to facilitate the development of international mindedness and global mindedness. I just had a conversation with Robert Harrison because, you know, the learner profile is undergoing review. And I said, is there any conversation about, instead of attributes, concepts? Not necessarily HET's dimensions, but big ideas and big concepts that schools can kind of hang on to in terms of defining international mindedness. Because that gives us a little bit more flexibility in terms of where we're from and who we are and what our understandings are wherever we live in the world. It kind of opens it up a little bit. So we had a really good conversation about that this morning. And which kind of goes along with, too, in lieu of assigning specific terms or attributes that could be considered hegemonic in nature, initiate the practice of employing the 5 dimensions of global-mindedness. That's a possibility. Remember, this is an independent study, not me as an IB staff member. An impact on current approaches to school reform through the identification of the dimensions and characteristics and support the development of global-mindedness. So can we look at these pieces? Can this be just as important as being a change leader, a pedagogical leader, an instructional leader? How do you develop the culture of your school community? We really can't expect schools and teachers to develop international or global-mindedness if the leader doesn't have any connection or understanding to what that means. Limitations, small sample size, 115. It was a purposeful sample, so I mean, they're in PYP schools, they know what international mindedness is. I don't think they're going to strongly agree with the fact that they should care about people in another world, or strongly disagree with that. So there's limited variability and validity. The survey was only offered in English, so I actually got I got a response from a principal in the Netherlands, and one of the questions was, what was your country of birth? And he said he was struggling with that because he was born in Australia, but then he was raised in the Netherlands, and he lived in New Zealand for a few years, so he wasn't quite sure how to answer that question. So there were some nuances that I wasn't able to pick up, A, because it was an English survey only, and that other piece, lack of qualitative data collection or analysis, I couldn't kind of dig down to see were they really responding the way that I had intended them to respond. Self-reporting by participants, so there's a potential for bias, and I might not be able to verify the information. And I may hide the interactions or cultural understandings because I only had single variables, so there were some limitations to that. So a little bit more work to do after I take a break. A long, long break. 10 years, a long, long break. Recommendations, take advantage of local cultural diversity through the establishment of meaningful cross-cultural strategies. I was actually going to put that people should travel more. I do think it's important, right? I think it makes a big difference. And then one of my committee members said, if I live in a country, she goes, you have to consider the demographic that you're talking to, Maria. It's a certain demographic that has the opportunity to travel. So what would you do if you lived in a country where people didn't have access to travel, they couldn't afford to travel? So I said local cultural diversity through the establishment of meaningful cross-cultural strategies. We have diverse communities, but we don't interact. We don't actually talk to each other. And for me, traveling abroad, the shift comes when I'm in a country where people don't speak English, because you count on the empathy of others to help you. You have to try to understand the local culture, try to make a sense of the language and the way that it's structured. So is there a way in our local communities, because we have people from different cultures everywhere that live, that we can have meaningful cultural interactions? Develop a leadership policy that supports travel experiences, exchanges, or study abroad. We have a tremendous opportunity to do that within the IB, right? Meaningful, like semester abroad, summer abroad, make that shift. So it's not just a week and I'm kind of doing the tourist thing, but I'm really interacting with the local culture. Is there a way that we can develop some policy that supports that? National, international levels, I think that's important. And not just to find out how they're doing it in Finland and how we can get a 92% literacy rate, but you know, how do things work in your schools and your cultures and your communities? So can we have policies for that? I found out from one of my committee members that when he was going for his PhD, second language was actually required. It was a school in the US, and he actually had to take an oral or a written test to prove his proficiency in a second language. I see people shaking their head. John Burrell, is that true? So can we bring that back, right? Initiate that, bilingual courses or formal second language qualifications and leader preparation programs. So if you don't speak a second language, can you have that opportunity or take that opportunity? That to me is what, it was one of the strongest relationships in the research. So I think it's that shift in mindset again. When you're learning a second language, when you're communicating in another language, that makes a big difference. So that's something that I'd really like to see us focus on. Actively explore opportunities for second language acquisition and meaningful travel or cultural experiences. PD and related to gender and cultural differences. I'm not saying that girls are better. I'm just saying there are differences in gender, and how do we learn from that? What are the characteristics of the male gender and the female gender, and how do we learn from that, right? Cultural differences in leadership. Robert was saying, I'm sure it's okay for me to say this, I was asking what are some of the things that are coming out when he's having conversations about the learner profile, and he said in Asia Pacific, there's the term spirituality keeps coming up, which I think is really interesting, right? So talking about, you know, differences across cultures, differences in leadership. And I think that this study definitely has to go through a mixed methods design. So there has to be a quantitative piece and then a qualitative follow-up piece so you can make sure that you're getting all the information you need. And I think some really rich data will come out of these conversations. And the other thing I found is these principals really wanted to clarify, they wanted to communicate, they wanted to have the conversations as well. So that would be great if we could do that. And I would really like to see this done as a comparative study, taking this instrument with members of people in non-IB schools. So public schools, state schools, whatever it might be, if you're not in an IB school, and look at the differences. And in that, I would be looking at the numbers, but it would be interesting to take a look at that. Okay, any questions? Questions, comments, conversation?
Do you think the results would be the same for MYP and diploma programs with the leaders in those schools?
Good question. Any thoughts on that? Because I've got some MYP and some DP people in here.
This is from a very narrow scope, but I think possibly there are more male leaders in the diploma schools, and so I think maybe your responses would be different because of that.
Any other thoughts about that? That's another thing I need to put in as a recommendation, is going across the programs, and then outside of schools that are IB schools. Yes. Oh, why do I think there was a gender difference? I looked into that a little bit, and they said that females have a more empathetic nature. They're the caregivers, they're nurturing, and males tend to, and this was really quick stuff that I read about, competitive, taking care of things in terms of heads of household and things like that. So they showed a little bit more empathy in that, and that was some really small stuff that I've done. And I actually have a PDF copy, which I'm happy to send anybody, because it's in there about what we found in terms of gender. But it was interesting to see that going all across the different studies. The culture piece, meaningful conversations for culture.
Having conversations that allow for people to share their ideas and their
And I think it's those things that make people uncomfortable, right? So provocations, really pushing people to the edge. I mean, it's happening in different places. I was in a school in Miami, and the kids were having a talk about the civil rights movement, and it was an MYP class actually. And one of the kids, and the kids were from different places, and one of the kids said, "Do you think that the African Americans took a step back because of the civil rights movement?" And the conversations that came up, because there was a student from Germany, and they talked about the Holocaust and the things that happened in the Holocaust. It was a really interesting way to look at very different cultural perspectives and ideas. Okay. But I think you're right, Lauren. I think that we need to be able to have that. And I think people are a little bit nervous about having those things, and I think we need to provide forums where they can really have those good conversations.
However, the hot, or at least in my neck of the woods, the hot terminology right now is courageous conversations, largely around race and that sort of thing. So if we can have those hot topic conversations, we should be able to talk about just what our interpretations and needs are for, because they are the underpinning. If you don't have a sense of global-mindedness, why would you initiate a second language requirement, in a school, whether you're IB or not? What's the point? So I just think that the conversations in general need to happen in the staff lounge, in professional development. Just the time, again, is the luxury.
Thanks. I'm glad, of course, that the second language requirement is there. What intrigues me, and John mentioned this a while ago, is that your study, though, showed that there wasn't any positive correlation between speaking a second language and global-mindedness, which is surprising because, in the IB we mandate it, and as we know, when one speaks another language, you know that people think differently. It's fundamentally cultural, and it's quite surprising, that result. Do you know why it came about? You're going to ask me to explain, right? But I don't know. Okay. Is it because you had 59% who didn't speak another language, so maybe it wasn't statistically significant? Okay.
Very small.
Okay. I guess the other thing was, just to comment on John's comment on the specificity of places. I was starting to think of Malouf's work on what was it in English? I can't remember the translation. In the Name of Identity, I think it was, Les Identités Meurtrières. But this is a slightly different topic, but he talks about one's identity is something that evolves throughout a lifetime. It's not specific to place. That you'll start off in a place and you'll take the context, but your place might be, the third culture kids are good examples of this. And it's a sort of an evolving concept, but it's not quite the same as global-mindedness, which is a different thing.
I actually had an interesting, I guess, attempt at this for an interview process, and I think it would fit really into this discussion, is that I was interviewing for assistant principal, so I looked at the IB employee profile and came up with targeted selection, which is situation, action, result questions for the interview. So I decided to put in one question on international mindedness, just to see as assistant principal that neither one came from an IB school, but we are an IB school. So I thought, well, let's see if a person can answer this question. Well, one of the assistant principals didn't even know what it was. Okay, that's so the need for professional development. Could not figure out what it meant. And we didn't want him to be too nervous, so he says, if you really don't know the answer to this question, because it was, how did your role as as a leader at your school, teacher leader, both of these individuals had already been assistant principals, so they were not coming from the teacher ranks. So as your role as a leader, how did you impact international mindedness at your school? Well, after the nervousness, and the guy had to skip the question, so the next gentleman came in, and I noticed his resume, and he had spent, I don't know, 5 years in the military, had been in several different countries, and actually was stationed in Hawaii, married a Peruvian, and so he says to me, well, I'm out on patrol, and this is what international mindedness is to me and how I would influence it in the classroom, is that when I'm out on patrol, there was a woman who believed in voodoo. I guess he was in Haiti at the time, and that felt the neighbor had cursed the other neighbor. And the military, well, that's just so stupid. How could they believe that? That is the dumbest thing. And they were really coming down on the woman. He said, no, I had to respect their belief, because how do I know? You know, just because their views are different than ours, they could be right too. So I'm thinking, boy, what a good answer. So obviously he got the job because he folded right into the IB mission statement that people from different views could be right as well. So it pointed out to me that the limited amount of knowledge, these are leaders, these were assistant principals, but it was the one that had traveled outside the United States, had been in several different countries. We meant to ask if he spoke Spanish, but we forgot because Beth was interviewing with me. But right away, it really fits into what you're discussing now. So I think certainly there's a great need. I don't even think you would have gotten these results if it was certainly a non-IB school, because at least we know we should be thinking this way, even if we might not be acting on it. But I believe leaders across certainly the United States don't even know what it is. So, thanks.
And to go back to what Lauren said and what Larry said and the importance of the role of the principal, you're not going to have those courageous conversations at a school if you don't have someone at the helm that's aware of that. And you know, I just did a Common Core presentation yesterday, and I know that's going to drive the discussion in the States about Common Core standards. And in my mind, that really means that you have to have a principal that remembers that international mindedness, the reason why we do what we do in IB schools, is the first part of everything that we do. That is the primary focus of everything that we do in an IB school. Academics is important, academic rigor is important, but there's a purpose for that academic rigor. And there's a reason that we want kids to be critical thinkers, because when they're influenced by media and everything else that happens, can they make critical decisions or reflective decisions or really good conversations? I don't know, do you guys want to take the time now to take this survey, or I'm just going to give it to you and show you what the numbers may or may not mean? I'm just going to show you, okay, because I want to get some information back from you. So notice I put a very high propensity because I didn't want to put levels. So the highest you can score is 200, the lowest you could score is 40. So that's where and most of the numbers were a little bit different on the scale that I used. And so the majority of the principals scored in that very top level, which you would expect actually from IB schools.
So we've got about 15 minutes, and what I would really like to do is kind of document your collective conversations and hear back from you what this means to you, recommendations for school leadership in the future. It doesn't have to be related to IB, anything that I can take back and kind of think about.
Well, I just have one comment in response to what you were mentioning with regard to your understanding of global-mindedness, because we were discussing that in our initial conversation, and we took it very differently. And just as an example, you know, we came a few days early, so we had an opportunity to spend some time in the area here. And I discovered that the Mayan people do not consider themselves Mexican because, and in fact, there was only a road connecting the Yucatan to Mexico and built in 1961, I think it was, or something like that. But anyway, so they, although obviously they are Mexican by citizenship, they have another identity that would get swallowed if their only identity is international mindedness. So although we had sort of landed on A, I like the idea that it might have been C because it allows people to have multiple identities. Global mindedness allows people to have multiple identities in a way that international mindedness might not. So that the one might, that it's not important where your citizenship is, your political boundaries, but it's too limiting in some respects anyway.
One of the things that I was thinking would be interesting to delve into is schools that are making use of video conferencing, virtual learning, all of the online mediums for connections to students and countries, and actually building a almost live relationship with them, because I certainly can see that as a powerful force. So I think that would be something to look into for further development of global-mindedness.
I found that's very interesting about the Mayan culture and their association or disassociation with Mexico, and it made me think that in our school, when we have cultures or people of either different nations or different cultures come in to speak, we have a stock beginning question that we always ask them. For the kids are trained in a sense, they ask questions, they've developed questions to learn how to ask them. And one of them is, the first one is always, what are the misconceptions about your culture? Which I think has always seemed to take our visitors by surprise, but that's the one that they always get the most passionate about, and that's where we do the most learning.
Excuse me. What's really fascinating to me about this is your recommendation about taking advantage of cultural diversity and the conversations that we can have focused on that. And what would differentiate internationally mindedness from global mindedness? What would be the transition from one to the other? I think different people have mentioned it. Maybe the example about the Mayans and their identity would be a criterion, and looking back at the characteristics where you see yourself as connected and taking action. But I'd like to hear other people's ideas on that, because that's the part that fascinates me.
I don't actually have a response, but I'm just thinking, I was involved some years ago with a class that looked at how different cultures deal with the aged, with elderly people. And it's a very telling thing because different cultures think differently. And so, you know, whereas in some cultures, most of the Western cultures, when people are very elderly and become ill and so on, usually they're institutionalized, right? Whereas in some cultures, that's anathema, that wouldn't be possible. And so this class was on the internet. It was actually a very homogeneous class in a state public school, but they got on the internet and asked the questions with some schools that they had connections with in different countries, different cultures, and they had responses about how people actually dealt with the elderly, with their grandmothers, their grandfathers, and as they got older and so on. And so in that class, these children actually were amazed because they didn't realize that other people thought about this differently and worked it in different ways. So it's sort of an example, but it doesn't answer your question.
So we're becoming aware of cultural differences.
Absolutely. Beyond nations, because it wasn't to do with nations, it was to do with cultures. And as, I mean, I said it before, ethnic groups, nations are political entities, that's clear. And cultures transverse nations, and there are many cultures within nations, and ethnic groups go across nations and so on. So what they were looking at was not anything national, and so I think, you know, in the terms of what we were saying before, we'd probably think of it as more global. What they were getting was a global response and not a national response to things, because within the one nation, I'm sure we could think of examples where certain cultures, well, you've only got to take United States. I mean, the Spanish-speaking people are usually of a Latin culture, and that's quite different from a Western Anglo-Saxon culture, quite different the way people think and act. So, you know, we're looking at something that's more global. But I come back to, and you touched on it, Maria, in the beginning, the whole trouble with the word global, and you quoted George, and he's written about this too, of course, is that it's connected now with demonstrations against the World Trade Center and all the rest of it. This is what people think of, and you know, dominance, economic dominance, and so that's where global itself is problematic in some ways. I'm sort of comfortable with global citizenship because that seems to mean something more to me, but global-mindedness, I have a slight, I don't know, something under the skin.
Well, so excuse me, because I missed the beginning, so I may not have the same sort of framework about international mindedness and global mindedness that came out of the early discussion, but I'm just kind of thinking of a lot of schools that don't have the opportunity perhaps to send students abroad, or some of the sort of more substantive ways to connect with, you know, internationally. And I think in some ways, what I'm conceiving of as global mindedness, there's actually more opportunity, because when I'm thinking about global mindedness and that sort of cultural piece, you can do that very locally, and you know, some of it's ethnic groups or language minority or majorities in your own country. But I think it gives you an opportunity to understand it. I mean, I'm thinking of the United States just geographically. I think of where and how my parents and the generations before them grew up in this same country is an entirely different experience because of some of the geographic changes that my parents chose to make before, you know, the next generations are born. And so some of those things, I think, allow us to understand ourselves nationally, I think, in a way that the focus on international mindedness may limit. And I think there's more of an opportunity for schools that don't have the resources to choose that. So.
And that makes me just ask a question that I don't know the answer to, but that IB has had to deal with, which is, why do people feel, beyond perhaps even the obvious, I don't know what's obvious, but why is there such a backlash by some right-wing, or that's my bias, by some groups against this particular aspect of the IB? That where if something shows up that's negative, it's about our membership in a global community. I wonder why. What are the reasons?
Sorry. I mean, one of them really relates to the whole, well, the whole thing about patriotism. And in Peterson's book about schools across frontiers, he talks about the fact, and this was mentioned a while ago, maybe even John mentioned it or Maria, But there's nothing wrong with patriotism. It's excessive patriotism that is wrong in the sense that it leads people to be fanatical. And so we always say in the IB that international mindedness, you can attain this better if you have a fundamental knowledge of your own culture, because it serves as a reference point to be able to appreciate others. Now, some people don't have that, but they're a minority. The third culture kids might not have that too much. So I think it's really to do with a fear that somehow global mindedness or international mindedness means that you're not worried about your own nation, and somehow this is more important than your own nation. And I don't believe that. I think having a national identity and cultural identity is very important if you're living in a country and you're living there for some time. But then you can go beyond that and do other things. I think that's where they're coming from. It's a fear of that. And also they associate the IB with the United Nations. And we are a recognized NGO, non-government organization of UNESCO since 1970, like hundreds of other organizations. They erroneously say that our programs are dictated by the UN, which is nonsense, of course. They're not dictated by anybody but ourselves and the schools we consult with. So it's a sort of an amalgam of things, I think. But I think it's basically a fear about patriotism, really.
Justin, do you want to say something?
Justin with the IB Research Department. But actually, what I wanted to say was, I think one of the things that can be kind of misleading about these terms of international and global, as Ian rightly pointed out, the issue is really cultures. And I think there's a tendency for us to talk about cultures as being the same as being ethnic groups, whereas teachers have their own cultures, students have their own cultures. A culture can shift from one group of students to another, like class to class to class. Each class has a culture. So it's more about creating international mindedness as the ability to recognize these differences and accept it. And it has nothing to do with skin color or language. It can actually very much have to do with skin color or language or these things, but they can exist on very, very small levels. And so it's that sort of interaction that I think we have to remember to bring into it on a regular basis.
I had one comment in the middle, and then I'm going to bring it to the front.
Okay, I was thinking here because I have lived in various different countries, and so it all started, I think, on the individual level for me, from narrow-mindedness to open-mindedness. So on the individual level, I started on being narrow-minded because I believed in my culture, my roots. I'm from Brazil, so I believed that the city where I lived, everything was right. Then I went to England, so things started opened up a little bit. Then in Spain, then in Italy, then in Russia, okay. So for me, this knowledge of the world connected to being open after some time and being able to accept the differences and not only accept, but see that sometimes the different is something that I would change in my own culture, would be relevant. And when I got back to Brazil after being abroad for 6 years, people said, "You've changed." And then I believe that I became a global citizen, but it's a process much more than a product.
And thank you for that, because it definitely is a process and hopefully a lifelong process.
Just two comments. I've been reflecting on the place we're staying here, which strikes me as a very globalized place. That is to say, it's nowhere. We are in a place which could be in Florida, it could be in Costa Rica, it could be anywhere, right? And there is nothing, and it's globalized because all we see is airplanes going over. God knows, they're going where. But that is one aspect of globalization, which is homogenization. Meanwhile, if you want to get out of here, you can't. If you try going for a run, you can't get past the gate. I guess they've been reading the statistics. But when you do get beyond, and you get to, you might get to Chichen Itza, or you might get to Valladolid, where you actually meet real people who seem to be living in a rather different style than we do here. It's quite odd, eh? And so I guess my first point is that globalization can be the end of specificity. So that's a bit of a challenge because it has that kind of homogenizing quality. The second thing that strikes me as we sit here in Mexico, meanwhile there are some demonstrations going on in Mexico City, I don't know if you know that, there are various realities which are specific to countries, to nations, which give context for all of these minority groups that live here, for example. And so if we're going to create a better world, which is in the introduction to the learner profile, that implies somehow an understanding of how power works in the world and how you actually have to change things through, let's say, national education systems, or if you're trying to do something about climate change and global warming, you actually have to have regulations and international systems which all relate to power and all which relate to nations. And in fact, nations are actually stronger than when the first study was written because of 9/11, because people have gone back to nations as being the units that determine the world. And if you wanted to change things in Syria, it wouldn't just be about being global-minded, you'd actually have to do something about power. So I think that it's just a reflection that we in the IB, I don't think we're really good at power. I don't think we really understand the importance of citizenship, engaged citizenship, which allows power to be changed. And I think there's a kind of naivete in believing that if I am personally ascribing to the 10 attributes of the learner profile, that ought to do it. It won't do it, because we need to do things collectively and politically and have some kind of solidarity with each other to change systems and to change the world and to create a better world.
Well, I have kind of a ill-formed thought, or a couple of thoughts regarding this notion of global citizenship that come out of my experience with my students, which is, I think you can be a citizen of a country by definition, which means you have certain obligations and certain responsibilities to that country, which involve acting in the kinds of ways that you're describing. And I don't think that my students have that kind of relationship on any kind of global scale, and I don't know what that would mean. So I think what is interesting for me to think about is, what is their relationship? Because they have relationships on a global scale with other people, and in ways that we didn't have in my generation. So my citizenship meant, it was synonymous with a lot of other things. It sort of determined initially, as I was growing up, where I would have friends, where I would be likely to work, where I would be likely to live. And it doesn't mean that for my students. It doesn't mean any of that. The fact that they're a citizen right now in this country doesn't necessarily mean anything about where their friends are or where they buy things from or any of the other kinds of important connections. So they are connected, and probably the multinational corporations have more impact on their lives in many ways than their own governments do in lots of cases. So the relationships are a lot more complicated, and they're not synonymous with citizenship in the way that they used to be.
One more, and then I think we're, quick.
I just wonder if anybody here thinks that Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed is an example of global-mindedness, knowledge, power, efficacy, and responsibility. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire. Is that an example of what we're talking about here?
I'm happy to give you the microphone.
I really like his whole philosophy, and I can remember something that he wrote about a child in a town in Latin America saying to the teacher, you know, I can hear the sound of motor cars or horses or whatever, and I know what that means in my culture because I've lived through this, and I hear certain things that you will never understand because you're a stranger. You've come into this place, and it's going to take you time. So I mean, I think what he was dealing with was basically probably not so much what we're talking about today, but more the culture of people in a local situation, and this fundamental. There's a wonderful definition of culture that I like, and it comes from a novel, not from any scholarly work, and it says culture is the secret conditioning of your origins. The secret conditioning of your origins, and I think that's a wonderful definition because it's I mean, what exactly is it? How you can't quite put your finger on it, but we all know we've got it, and it comes not just from the family, it's from everything around, it's from the smells, the sounds, and everything. And that's what I think, you know, Freire went much further than that, but he talked about pedagogy a lot. But I don't, from what I remember of his work, I don't actually think he was talking about what we're talking about, but I might be wrong.
The concept of knowledge, power, making contributions, and taking control of your lives, and growing out of, you know, where you were born, so that you become more global-minded.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for your conversations, and I hope you keep this going. I certainly have more questions than I did when I started this venture, and our time together is up. But before we leave, and I know he's not going to like this, I just want to thank Ian for being here. And I'm sure you heard when he won the Inspiration Award, which was well-deserved, that he's retiring from the IB, but I know he's going to still be around. He's certainly inspired me, and I know many of the other staff members have said how they've inspired him. And his work and George's work about really making sure that we didn't forget about international mindedness and the reason that we love and work for the IB. So thank you for that personally and from the group. There's supposed to be a great plenary speaker. Thank you for coming, and safe travels home.